Hey, listeners, welcome to the Inspired Writer Collective podcast today. It's going to be a great day focusing on the craft and kind of revisiting the foundation of showing versus telling. You're in for a real treat because Elizabeth has put together a fabulous presentation that she shared with a local group here in Colorado, the Central Colorado Writers, which is a really wonderful group that we're fortunate to be a part of. And it was just really nice to go back and think about some of these basics that sometimes we forget about as experienced writers, authors, and reminding ourselves about paying attention to these aspects of the text. If you're interested in getting the PowerPoint for this presentation, there is a link in the description that you can put your email address in and subscribe to our newsletter, and you'll get the PowerPoint that goes right along with this. So if that's of interest to you, we invite you to do that. And when you subscribe to our email list, you get a weekly email with special updates, info about upcoming courses, and info related to our podcast. So I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth, and she's going to do most of the talking, but I'll be jumping in from time to time. But here we go.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, the other piece of getting that PDF of this presentation is that it'll also include 5 writing prompts that will allow you to practice what we're talking about today. So that will not be covered in this podcast episode itself, but those 5 writing prompts are included within the PDF that you'll receive when you subscribe. So if that's of interest to you, if this is something you want to practice, we encourage you to check that out. So we're talking about showing versus telling. And this is a really common source of feedback that writers get back from their editors, from their beta readers, from peer reviewers, because we as writers have a tendency to do more telling than showing. But it's the showing piece that really allows your reader to be immersed in your story. So showing is where the descriptions that you provide as a writer leave room for reader interpretation and imagination versus explicitly conveying information to the reader. So if you said Susie was sad, that is telling. If you show that Susie is a little bit hunched over, her shoulders are drooped, her gaze is downward, you're showing aspects that relate to sadness, but allow the reader to infer that from what you're writing, and it puts the reader much deeper into the story. You're aiding the reader's experience of the story when you use showing, and also it creates a slower pace for the reader. And so that allows them to be immersed in the scene and just also helps you as the writer control the pacing of your book. Now, telling isn't all bad. There's a time and a place for telling, particularly when you're having to summarize some backstory information that's relevant for the reader comprehension, but that you don't want to take a whole lot of time to integrate it in. So little chunks of backstory may be done through a telling format. Also, when you're trying to actually create a faster pacing, then telling is an approach you can use because that style, that way of conveying information is naturally faster in pace. And the main way that I see this coming up in memoir is that there's a tendency for memoirists to use prior journal entries to serve as the backbone or foundation for their memoir writing. And while journals are great for jogging the memory, especially because memory fades and gets fuzzy and morphs in all sorts of interesting ways, as I've found, and I know others have found, the problem is that when you journal, you are doing telling. You're not describing in your daily journal, all those nuances and the feelings and the, body sensations that are occurring in the moment. You're pretty much stating what your emotions are directly, why your emotions are that way, what actions happened. So it's much more of a telling format. So that's why I warn or caution memoir writers against quoting or using directly from their journal as opposed to using that as their memory jogger. Stephanie, how do you see this showing up as a challenge for you in your writing?
Well, I definitely find that I am definitely more inclined to be telling, because especially since I'm working on my first book in my series, I'm telling myself the story. So I have to be careful about paying attention to balancing the telling and the showing so that I'm not just telling. And since I'm doing fiction, it's a lot of dialogue actually really help to move the story along with showing what's going on, because you can get a lot from that. But yeah, I definitely will say it's a challenge, and so that's why I appreciate all of these reminders to think about that as I'm going back and looking at my work, to remember, where is the balance, because you don't want huge blocks of text that just bogs the reader down with information that you could so easily show them through whatever you're doing when you're writing your story, or you're doing with others in your memoir, or whatever it might look like, where you can really bring the reader in more and make them feel like they're a part of the story.
Definitely. So now we're going to go through 7 ways that you can identify those moments where you're telling in your manuscript, in your novel or your story. And then we're going to talk about what you can do in the editing steps to convert those moments from telling to showing. So, the 7 ways to identify telling in your own writing. 1, like the example I gave at the beginning, is any named emotions. So anytime where you state what the emotion is of a character, that is a place where you could convert it to providing descriptions about how that emotion is appearing in their body, how that's physically being represented, maybe the internal sensations that come along with it. If you struggle with that, and I know I certainly do, especially when I'm revisiting the same emotion over and over in different scenes, I highly recommend The Emotion Thesaurus. This is by Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi. And this book has 2 pages for each emotion, and there's hundreds of different emotions in here. I think this says it have 130 entries. So what you get when you open the book to a particular emotion is a definition of the emotion, a long list, basically a page-long list of the physical signals and behaviors. You get some internal sensations, mental responses, acute or long-term responses for the emotion, and even signs that the emotion is being suppressed, because we as humans do not always outwardly express or show the emotions that we're feeling. So that may be relevant for your story. For example, in this example of defensiveness, one of the ways that the sign that the emotion is being suppressed is maintaining an even tone or offering a fake smile. This book is also great because it also provides associated power verbs, which goes to number 2. So removing the use of ly adverbs. A lot of times when we're using, naturally, slowly, carefully, followed by the verb, it usually indicates, 1, that we're in telling mode, but also that we could find a stronger verb that would convey that same concept. So removing that adverb and weak verb, replacing it with a stronger verb. Another area that will indicate to you that you're using telling is info dumping. So you can see this clearly on your manuscript when you see a big chunk of blocking text. As Stephanie said, you can break this up with dialogue. Some of the message can be conveyed through someone telling someone else dialogue to convey that information versus just backstory. Or there may be parts that you can cut altogether. You may also be able to break up some of that backstory with action occurring in the scene. So instead of telling it all in one chunk, maybe you have an action that occurs in the middle of that information dump to break it up into 2 smaller chunks, and that'll help keep the reader engaged. A lot of times our eyes, when we're reading a story, will just kind of naturally skip over because we know that that's just backstory. Number 4 is when you find yourself recapping events that happened off scene, meaning that this scene is not currently depicted in the book and you're just recapping for the reader what happened. Maybe a secondary character walks into the scene and tells the main character, oh, you missed it. This blah, 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 blah happened. The recommendation in this case is to instead not include that scene, to actually put the reader in that scene, even if the main character is not a part of it, just so that the reader can experience what's happening in that scene. Then you're showing them versus just regurgitating a recapped version. Number 5 is one that comes up in memoir of showing many versus one. So instead of describing your interest in roller coasters and going to amusement parks, choose one significant day where you went to the amusement park and rode the roller coasters, put the reader into the scene, giving specifics and examples, and then conveying through that scene that this is something that you've always enjoyed, that you're excited this time. This is the 10th time you've made this trip and ridden this specific roller coaster, but put us in the seat, strap us in, take us for that ride as the reader. Number 6 is being vague versus specific. So when you have the opportunity to describe, what is occurring in the scene, maybe you had, a car crash. Tell us what kind of car crashed into you. Even if you don't exactly remember, you can make a reasonable guess of what kind of cars were common at that time, what style of vehicle it was, whether it was sedan style, whether it was van, truck, and give us a specific example that would fit that. So tell us it was an F-150, and pick the color versus just saying it was a truck. It allows the reader to have a much clearer movie playing in their head of the scene, which is going to keep them reading. And number 7 is saying what isn't in the scene. So sometimes when we're telling, what we end up doing is saying that there were no books on the bookshelf. But instead of saying there are no books, show the layer of dust that's on the bookshelf. Show the little spider web that's starting in the corner. Give the reader a sense of what is there. And that's going to be so much more engaging than just telling them what's not there. Again, you're really wanting to think about your story as like a visual movie, and you want to capture the essence of what things are there so that your reader is really engaged with what they're reading. Stephanie, are there any of these approaches that are troublesome for you or that you like to do that you find, easier to do than others?
Well, actually, one of the things that came to mind as you were going through all of those different aspects of telling was remembering how the reader wants to be able to discover a lot for themselves. And so when you get yourself into any of those 7 essentially stages of telling, and you certainly don't want to have all 7 in, at all in your manuscript, because then the reader is really going to feel like, well, maybe the writer doesn't trust me if they're having to give me all of these details or give me this backstory that doesn't really relate to what's happening for the person telling your story. And especially with memoir is, people often read memoir for a purpose. There's an aspect of they want to know about your experience, but in a lot of ways, it's also something about themselves that they've picked that book up. And so it's really important to allow them to put themselves in the scene. And so, giving them too many pieces of information or telling them things that are irrelevant, even though you might feel they're relevant, you don't want to talk yourself in circles. I mean, it's common in our everyday conversation that we veer off or we go different ways, but that's different when you're having a conversation. You don't want to have your manuscript become this convoluted conversation that's confusing the reader. So that's what was coming to mind as I was thinking about all those things, as I was thinking, if you're putting all of those telling pieces in your book, the reader's going to feel that they're not trusted, and odds are they'll put your book down. So that's also something important to think about.
For sure. And the thing that you brought up with the telling piece made me think of something I was recently reading in Storyworthy by Matthew Dixon. He talks about the value of slowing the audience down because he's usually telling his stories live, but the same can be true for a reader. When you're right on that moment of revealing something to the audience or to the reader, then is the time to give all this superfluous detail that's not relevant to the story, because you're increasing and ratcheting up the tension, because the reader is already ready to see, okay, you knocked on this door, what's going to happen next? That's when you describe the lighting and the bugs flying around and the, sweat, or, something that relates to that character's current emotion and anticipation. You start to talk about their hopes and their plans and what they think is going to happen. And then you hit them with the actual action. But you're using those telling moments strategically to ratchet up the tension. So this is not, to demonize telling. You don't want to go all showing either. But this is just a caution to use it strategically. There are ways that you can use it that really benefit the story as opposed to distract from the story. So when you are going through your manuscript and you're finding areas in which you are seeing one or a few of those 7 different indicators of excessive telling, some of the things you can do are, number 1, use some strong verbs. That's what I described in regards to removing those ly adverbs. A lot of those can be replaced with just a stronger verb. Again, resources like the Emotion Thesaurus or just your general online thesauruses can really help in racking your brain for better verbs that you can use. I've also done some really fun brainstorming and journaling exercises where you pick an occupation and you write down all the verbs that occupation would do, like a chef, right? So chopping and sauteing and all that kind of stuff, mincing, braising, and then you use those verbs in a out of context way. So maybe, instead of talking about sauteing onions, maybe it's so hot outside and you feel like you're sauteing in the heat. So it's using these fun verbs in a different way. So that's a fun exercise to help just you get in the habit of finding some stronger verbs and more descriptive verbs. Another thing is using specific nouns and clear adjectives, which really paint a picture for the reader. Number 3 is including sensory details. So giving the reader an idea of, the smells and the sounds and the other things occurring in the scene to really root them in the scene, versus saying something that's just more likely descriptive of the room was messy. Tell us how it was messy. Were there rings on the desktop from old cups of coffee? Was there a stack of dirty plates, on the bedside table? That tells us a lot more about the character who occupies that space, about the space itself, than just saying that a space was messy. And then, as Stephanie said earlier, another key way, especially when you're having to provide some backstory that's relevant, is to try to find ways to communicate that through dialogue. So maybe you have a secondary character, say, oh, well, at least that person's better than your ex. Remember that time he did yada yada? And so then you're conveying that message through dialogue, and then the main character can respond to that, and we can get some insight into their feelings on that and where they currently stand, versus just providing backstory of, Lucy had a horrible ex that didn't treat her well, and this is a prior event that happened. Make reference to it through dialogue. So the last piece we're going to cover today is about showing emotion, because so much of telling that could really be enhance the story by switching it to showing is around emotion. So we have our verbal way of communication, which is dialogue, which we've already talked about several times as being a great way to shift from telling to showing. But there's also a whole litany of nonverbal communication which can be really effective in showing your character's emotion, the things they're trying to hide and stifle, and just their current shifts within the scene and how their emotions are changing or evolving. So for your nonverbal communication, there are vocal cues. That would be things like a shift in volume. Maybe all of a sudden they're really loud and then they really start to get a little bit shy about what they're saying and unsure and uncertain. And now they're looking down like I'm doing, and their voice softens because they're not really confident anymore about what they're saying. All of that can be translated through volume, and you could describe that by describing their volume. Also, their tone could change. They could go from snippy to more breathy. You can use cracks describe cracks in their voice when they get close to tears. Maybe they're totally done with the situation and all of a sudden their tone shifts to something just expressionless and flat because they just don't care anymore. So you can convey a lot of emotion through these vocal cues. Pitch is another one, whether they're high and shrill or common in romance novels, low and rumbly, right? So that can convey a certain emotion or desires or wishes and a number of different things better than saying, he was attracted to her. Also, you can use shifts in speech patterns, sudden use of poor grammar or profanity. Maybe your character develops a stutter or a lisp when they get nervous or uncomfortable. And also body language. So those are all the vocal cues, but going into the body language, you can see how the body outwardly responds to what we experience with our emotions. We have less conscious control over our bodies when we're feeling a stronger emotion. And that's where the Emotion Thesaurus book is really helpful, because it's got that whole list for each of these emotions about how that may be physically represented. Another nonverbal communication is the thoughts that happen in your character's head. These are windows into the mental process. They're not always rational. They may skip from topic to topic. And they convey how the character is viewing their world through the filter of that particular emotion. So today, they may see this flower growing through the crack in the pavement, and they may see that as beautiful because they're in a positive state of mind. But a different day, they may see that dandelion growing through the crack and be angry about it because it's inconvenient and ugly, and because this is how they're viewing their world right now. So you can use thoughts in order to clue the reader into how the character is feeling without just giving the reader the blanket boring, he was having a bad day, or she was on cloud nine after, spending an evening with her love interest. And then we also have visceral reactions. These are things, internal sensations such as heightened heart rate, lightheadedness, adrenaline spikes. These are uncontrolled. These are instinctive reactions that your reader will be able to relate to as a fellow human. But because of their strength, use these at key moments in your story. Use them sparingly, or else it could come off as being a little bit melodramatic otherwise. Stephanie, are there any of these that you like to use or that you forget to use?
Well, I've definitely used, the last one, the visceral, I've definitely used that in sort of the pivotal encounter moments. And then just some of the sort of the facial expression, the body language, how someone's moving or moving away or moving towards, or, leaning in or leaning, all of those things, but thinking about what people do. And it really made me think about how, as writers, being observers is so important, because you can certainly think about how you respond to situations and think like, okay, when I'm angry, what do I do? And, and those are places I go. I think like, okay, when I'm sad, what do I do? What are my hands doing? What are my eyes doing? What are my shoulders doing? Am I tensing up? Am I relaxing? Am I, wanting to just curl up in a ball under the blanket and, escape from the world? Or am I ready to like jump for joy, and thinking about all the ways that we can react to things ourselves. But what's really helpful, I know for me, is, and this is part of the reason why I love to go to coffee shops, is because I'm always fascinated watching other people. Or if I'm out to dinner, I'm always noticing and thinking, like looking over at the table, like, I wonder if those people are on our first date. Like, what are the clues that are maybe cluing me into it? Or what conversation are they having that, and thinking about all of those elements. And so being an observer of people can also be really helpful because you can think about what other people are doing and not just only have it relate to yourself, to really remember, how we as humans are in the world, showing so much non-verbally sometimes. And so it's important to think about that. And like you said, like, you know, definitely with emotions, you want to show it more, because if you tell it, then again, it taking away from the reader ability to put themselves right there. And like you also said, we don't want to demonize telling, because it is an important part of your story. You need both, but you need to have a balance.
Yeah, and sometimes it can be really powerful to give the showing version and then do a brief telling that confirms the reader's suspicions that, oh yeah, this person's not really happy, or this person suddenly got nervous, you know? Sometimes you can do that through the like internal dialogue or thoughts. The part of this that I tend to ignore or to have like don't lean into the most is all those vocal cues, but they can be so powerful. And I think it takes a little bit more work to capture those in writing versus, like screenplay sort of setting. But I think it's so telling the word choice we use and how we say it and the volume and the pitch and even the cadence, if someone like blurts something out versus, they slowly talk about something, it really conveys so much. And that's one area that I think could be really powerful, but I do not have a tendency to just naturally think about how I can add that into my dialogue or into my, description of my story. And then the last little bit I want to cover today is just a little bit about hidden emotions. So, as I talked about earlier, we're all human, but most people don't wear their emotions on their sleeves. Even if you have one character in your story who does, not all of your characters are going to. They're going to be different and unique. And so there's some 4 techniques for hidden emotions. So the first one is over and under reactions. So this is where you establish a baseline of emotions for a particular character, and then they react in a certain situation of tension or conflict in a way that's contrary to their baseline. So maybe they are normally very bubbly and easygoing and suddenly become super reserved. Or maybe they're more reserved as their baseline and all of a sudden they overreact. So those can indicate to the reader that something is going on emotionally for that character. And that's a great way of showing it. Tics and tells are also another way to show hidden emotion. So even if it's not coming up in dialogue, even if they're not giving anything away with their tone, with their body language, in a sense, tics are a little bit body language, but it can be things like biting their lip, spinning their wedding ring. When I watch Weeds, that series, one of the characters is always chewing on her straws. And she does it when she's unsure about things and nervous about things and uncertain. So you can give your characters certain tics or tells for when they are feeling emotion, even if they can't show it in that particular moment. The third one is the fight, flight, or freeze responses. So we as humans, each of us have a natural tendency towards one of these 3. And you could show that within your character. So maybe if your character had their tendency is to use a freeze response when they have heightened emotions, maybe they stop what they're doing mid-activity. Or maybe you show them getting extra agitated because they go into a fight mode whenever they feel threatened. So by using one of these three, you're cluing the reader into the fact that this character is suddenly feeling threatened in some way. So even if we don't understand yet, haven't been told yet as the reader what's going on exactly or why this, character is reacting this way to this person that just walked in, that's going to increase the tension of the scene if you can show that the character is emotionally reacting to what's happening in their environment, even before we get the background information of, oh, this is this person's ex, or they just had a falling out the day before with this friend. This helps convey that and show that without just telling, and it makes the story much more engaging for the reader. The fourth one of these and the last one is the passive-aggressive reactions. So hidden anger, where they're not comfortable expressing it, and showing that contrast through their thoughts. So they're acting in one way, but the reader is also shown their thoughts, which are contradictory. And so you may see this through dialogue of sarcasm, framing insults as jokes, giving backhanded compliments, or not saying what they really mean. The classic, husband asks the wife what's wrong, and she says, "I'm fine," right? And so that's an indication, kind of a universally understood example of like, no, she's not fine. So those are great ways to even show the hidden emotions, because not every emotion is going to be front and center. So you can use one of those 4 techniques in order to indicate to the reader that there is some emotion going on, even if they're not clued into what that emotion exactly is yet. So that's what I have for you guys today as far as the showing versus telling. And I hope you'll be able to use some of these principles. I know we covered a lot of information. So again, that PDF is available, which has all of this outlined on it, as well as some writing prompts about exploring how to show, for example, someone's occupation without saying what it is specifically that they do. So instead of saying Harold was a doctor, describe what his, daily work was like. Stephanie, do you have anything else you'd like to add for our listeners today?
No, I think you covered it wonderfully, and it's so much fun when we get these opportunities to sort of talk and workshop through these foundational ideas that we often forget about coming back to. And regardless of where you are in your writing journey, there's always something good about repeating and going back and doing what's good. And that was something that came up in my yoga practice this morning. There's a quote, I believe it's by Plato, about there's nothing wrong with doing the same thing over again, or something to that effect. I don't have the specific words, but I think that that's one of the things that's important to remember in writing, is that it's constantly a practice and we're always making progress, and there's nothing wrong with going back to these foundational ideas and remembering to bring them into our work.
Amazing. Well, if you enjoyed this episode, please like it, subscribe to the channel, share with a writing friend, and we look forward to talking with you more next week.